Good evening, class. Welcome to POLSC2303, Introduction to International Relations. Once again, I am your Professor J. Weston Jameson, and today we are going to finish our conversation about financial relations. Today we're going to be talking about austerity versus stimulus, okay? And the first thing we need to understand about austerity versus stimulus is, what is money? But before we get to that, I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the test you guys took last week that should be graded, and your grades should be up on Moodle, and I hope everybody saw their grades. First of all, I want to say that you guys as a class scored the exact same average that you did last test, okay? The average was 77.5. And you can see here we had a lot of A's. There was several A's in the class. And then it got scattered down to some C's and then some D's, and then there was one failing grade. But I am hopeful that everybody is still doing fine in this class. I believe that everybody still is in line to pass, at least the ones that are trying to pass. And keep in mind that I will drop the lowest test grade in the class that, of each individual person. So, if we move along from this, I didn't think there was any questions that were too tricky, but let's talk about money. First of all, the question is, what is money? Somebody once told me that money is fiction. Unfortunately, we all need money to survive, so money's not that much of fiction. But if we really think about the dollars in your pocket, we think, what gives that money value? And the only thing that gives that money value is the thought that when you turn that dollar over to somebody, he's going to give you what that dollar is worth. Now, what that dollar is worth is completely based on confidence. If you look on your $1 bill, it says, "In God we trust." It is not backed by gold. It is not backed by anything other than the trust that we have in our own currency. So money has several social functions in our society. It's the easiest way to determine the merit of our actions. It is how we determine how well we do at work. And obviously, it is a medium of exchange. If you want some eggs, you pay the $3 and you get eggs. Money also is our store of value. It is how we maintain the amount that we have in our banks. It is a unit of account. So keep in mind these four things are what we will call money for this class. And this is very easily a test question. As I said earlier, we only give our money by our confidence. Our money gives value by the confidence that we have in it. So what we call that is a fiat money system. Now the word fiat literally means legal tender by government decree, okay? So it's just saying that that dollar is worth $1 because the government says it's worth $1. If people lose confidence in our government, then our money will no longer be worth what we think it is. Now, this has had several failures along in history. Some of the older ones in Rome, the silver percentage that they put in their silver became less and less and less, and therefore the money inflated. The money was becoming less and less and less. In China, Kublai Khan had his flying money, and he just thought if he printed more money, he would become richer. In France, they've had several failures with fiat money. They have l'euro and the assonance and the franc. Please excuse my French accent, but yes, all of these currencies failed because they kept printing more and more and more of this money. Now, printing money does not mean that you have more money. It means that the money that you have becomes less and less valuable. A more recent example is Mexico in 1994. In 1994, the Mexican peso completely crashed by 14%, right? So that means that it took 14% more pesos to equal $1. This essentially crashed the Mexican economy. When you need more money in one day to be able to buy the loaf of bread, most people can't afford that. There's an even more recent example in Thailand in 1997. This actually caused a ginormous crash, okay? So in 1997, we see that the Thai baht completely went down very quickly in about one day, I think 2 days maybe. But there's a very interesting story behind the Thailand crash. There was a very rich investor that bought in very, very early and rode out the crash. His name is George Soros. Many of you guys may have heard of him. If you look here, George Soros bought into the Thai baht well before the crash and essentially rode out the crash as the Thai baht kept increasing in currency. He ended up making a lot of money, an extreme amount of money. So one has to wonder, what did he know that other investors did not know, or the, the, the government of Thailand, for example? But if we look at this graph, this is the graph of a lot of Asian currencies. And what we see is Thailand led this crash. And then once Thailand's currency crashed, it would seem that all of the other Asian currencies crashed. We now call this the Asian currency crisis that happened in the 90s. That, by the way, may or may not have led to the dot-com bubble crash. So, in even more recently, in 2008, we see that Zimbabwe's currency in 2001 was 112% to the dollar. That's relatively stable. But as we look down the line, the longer we go, we see that it eventually got out of control and it grew exponentially. So how does something like this happen? Well, it's called hyperinflation. And it's when the value of your dollar decreases so rapidly that your currency essentially becomes worthless. Now, this is often caused by long persistent government deficits financed by money creation. So, when your government is in debt and nobody's paying taxes, often because of war or financial crisis, or you've had an immigration crisis, where people stop paying taxes, all of a sudden your government now has to create money to be able to pay the taxes or to pay the debt that it owes, right? So we in America have this issue as well. A lot of the time we have one of the largest debts in the world. Some people think that America is flat broke because we owe so much money due to our own wars and our own willingness to help out our poor and to pay our military. And you can see by this graph that we are up to 14 trillion, and this was in 2010. We are far surpassed that by now. And we have to wonder, who owns this debt? Well, number one is China. Now, China, we consider a friend, but they could call in that debt at any time. And if they do call in that debt, we would not be able to pay what we owe them. Now, Japan is very dearly our friend, and they would never do that to us. Same thing with Belgium and a lot of the Caribbean countries. But if we look at number 5, that is oil exporters. Now, when we talk about oil exporters, we're talking about countries like Libya. We're talking about countries like Saudi Arabia. Countries that wouldn't necessarily be considered our friend. Now, that is a very dangerous position to be in. We don't want to owe people money that we really don't want to call back and say, hey, we can't pay you. But for right now, our U.S. tax base seems to be pretty strong. We have maintained a course where everybody seems to be able to pay the taxes that they owe. But how long can we keep this up? If you look at this graph right here, corporations have paid gradually less and less taxes over the last, say, 50 years compared to the individual taxpayer, which seems to be paying more and more as time goes on. Now, we tax our corporations less so that we can keep them in America because we need those jobs, and we don't want these corporations to go somewhere else where they may have to pay less taxes. So, one of the things that we need to think about too is how much money is left in the system. How many dollars are available to you and I and any other taxpayer? And we can see that the money supply has been steadily increasing for a very long time. And in some places, it's increasing quite rapidly. Those gray bands are recessions. So this brings us to what happens after a recession, okay? So after an economic crisis, you have two options. Now, the first option is stimulus, okay? So what is stimulus? Stimulus is injecting currency into the financial system. Now, we have a bank that does that. We call it the Federal Reserve. But we have two options. Our government has two options. They could either use fiscal policy, and that's money controlled by the government, or monetary policy, which is money controlled by the central bank. Again, our Federal Reserve. So, after crisis, you have two options. You can go stimulus or austerity. But if you choose stimulus, you then have two more options, fiscal policy or monetary policy. So if we start with fiscal policy, we see that there are three things that you can do in fiscal policy. Number one, you could go direct spending. We saw George W. Bush in 2004 do this. He just sent $300 to literally every person in the United States. You opened your mail and you got a $300 check from the government. Now, the government was hoping that you spent this money on things to revive the economy. You could also do job programs. Now, FDR did this with New Deal, and he started the Works Progress Administration. This is not unlike what Obama did with his shovel-ready jobs. Last thing you can do is cut taxes. Now, President Trump is talking about this. President Bush did this after 9/11 when people stopped spending. And Obama kind of did this when he left the Bush tax cuts in 2008 and 2009 after that financial crisis. Cutting taxes is a very interesting way to boost the economy because essentially it's a mind game. It's saying, no, we're just not going to take more of your money. You can actually keep the money that we were thinking about taking. So then we can go to monetary policy. Now, there's only one way to do monetary policy. It's called quantitative easing. Essentially, this is injecting money from nothing, out of thin air, into the banking system. Now, this is a lot like we were talking about when we talk about Zimbabwe, when we talk about this hyperinflation. The goal is to put money into the banks, right? So if the banks have a lot of cash, hopefully they will loan it out to people. But essentially, this just creates more debt because what we're asking for is more people to take loans on. We want to give them more opportunities to invest this money, right? So when we talk about quantitative easing, it is something that's been going on since 2008. Consistently for, almost 10 years now, we have seen the Federal Reserve inject money into our system. If you look at this graph, you see QE1, QE2, QE3. We are now on QE4. Now that is the phases that the Fed is going through. And you can see with each QE number, there is a slight bump in the money supply. And if you look at the S&P 500, which is essentially just a measure of the stock market, it has increased every single time the Fed puts money into the market. Okay, so if you're not going to stimulate your economy, you could choose austerity. Now, this is what Europe did after the 2007-2008 crash. What is austerity? Well, Merriam-Webster defines it as a situation in which there is not much money and it is spent only on things that are necessary. So, what does this mean for the government? Well, most social programs are cut back. That means that a lot of old people might not get the medical benefits they need. Taxes are increased, so that means that everybody's hurt a little bit more with the money they make. And the government actually causes a recession in the society. Now, why would they do that? Well, they do that so that we tighten our belts, okay? Essentially, this reduces the deficit. They're able to pay back some of the debt. So, led by Germany, the EU is absolutely terrified of inflation. Remember that Germany, after World War II, suffered extremely high inflation. So everybody's extremely scared of inflation, especially hyperinflation in Europe. Bankers there prefer austerity in hopes of avoiding massive inflation, right? They have these memories of World War II that they are trying to avoid. Now, America, we're much more, gung-ho and cowboy, and we have no problem injecting money into our system. And if we look at this graph, we are asking ourselves, which one is better? Well, America is the blue/green line, and Europe is the red line. Now, we can see that over time, they have sort of tried to increase the money supply there, but over time, they have decreased it, right? Whereas America has taken exactly the opposite route and increased it extremely. Now, there are some smaller graphs there, and especially if we look at unemployment, we see that we are far less unemployed than the Europeans. They have an extremely high unemployment rate after the 2008-2009 crash. Furthermore, if we look at economic growth, while we have been extremely up and down, and that can be good or bad for us, Europe has stayed pretty consistent, but far below what the United States is doing. Now, what do you think's better? Is austerity better or is stimulus better? I can't tell you which one is better. All I can tell you is we'll have to wait and see. But what is the future for the U.S.? Well, it seems to be pretty scary. If we look at our GDP, it is completely increasing at breakneck speed. But if we look at that bottom line there, that is the median weekly earnings. That is how much we as Americans are earning. And we are not keeping up with the growth that America is achieving. Now, if we look at this graph, we see that the blue line is the top 1% earnings. Now, if we look, the last time they reached the peaks that they are at right now, that was in 1929, approximately right before the Great Depression. So, we have to ask ourselves, are we heading for another Great Depression? Have we bungled our financial system up so badly that we can't pay back our debts and only the very, very rich are making money? If we look, they are making money. We are not. What happens when things like that happen? Unrest. If you remember Occupy Wall Street in, I don't know, I guess that was 2010, 2011, there were people just waiting outside of Wall Street. And this happened in every city across the United States. A lot of people saying, I am too big to fail. Why don't you bail me out? Why did you bail out all these other companies and banks and just sell out the American people? This was in Greece when they tried austerity. Austerity, again, cutting back all of these, programs. This drove people to riot. So really, you can't win. When you have a financial crisis, people are going to be upset, whether you stimulate or whether you use austerity and cut back everything. So what does the government do to avoid these things? Well, we should try to maintain optimal balances. We should try to lower our debt. We have a lot of issues coming up down the road. If we look, China has the mother of all bubbles on its way. Their housing crisis could be worse than ours, right? They have had a 698% increase in their housing values. How is that possible? That is certainly going back to what we saw in 2005, 2004, right before our crash. So if China fails, will they have the same kind of reverberations throughout the world that happens when we failed? So a little bit of advice. You want to keep your debt low. You want to read the business pages. That's the only truth without bias in the news anymore. Don't trust CNN or Fox News. Find a job, but more than that, build a career. All right, so a couple of essay prompts for you guys. First one, if you were in control of the Federal Reserve Bank and America just suffered an economic recession, are you stimulating the economy? Or are you implementing austerity? And I would like to know why. Both have their ups and downs. Number two, often when economic hardships due to recession or unemployment threaten a nation, the people protest. We remember the Occupy movement, the riots in Greece. What is your thoughts on protesting? How should it be carried out? Is violence ever necessary in protesting? I want to know why. And as always, I am looking for a one-page double-spaced MLA consistent essay with at least 2 academic references cited both in text and on your reference page, emailed to me by Friday, November 3rd by midnight. You guys are really doing good. Everybody looks to be in line to at least pass the course. But if you guys are running into any issues, please do not hesitate to email me. Have a good week.